The evening carried with it the kind of fragile peace that families cling to when they are waiting for something monumental. The house was quiet, the lights dim, and the air filled with the anticipation of new beginnings. A baby's arrival is supposed to be a moment of joy, a chapter of hope that erases every hardship that came before it. For months, the routine had been careful, deliberate, and centered on protecting the miracle growing within a fragile body. Every step was measured, every precaution taken, and every day felt like another small victory in the countdown to new life. Yet sometimes peace shatters without warning, and the comfort of a waiting home turns into the battleground of fear. That night, the tremors of disaster began subtly, with discomfort that seemed harmless, until they spiraled into pain so raw it felt like the entire world had shifted its weight onto one fragile soul. Pregnancy is a beautiful yet vulnerable state, balancing life on a thread finer than most realize. What begins as mild unease can erupt into a storm of complications, leaving loved ones scrambling for answers. On that night, the signs were unmistakable: sharp, breath-stealing pain radiating through a body already stretched to its limits. It was the kind of pain that demanded urgent intervention, the kind of crisis where every second mattered. When life is measured in minutes, hope takes the form of flashing lights and the sound of sirens racing through the night. Calling for help was instinctive, an act of desperation wrapped in love and fear, the only choice when the threat of loss loomed so close. Within moments, the familiar sound of an ambulance siren broke the stillness, its approach carrying with it the promise of trained hands, medical equipment, and the chance to preserve both mother and child. Relief swept in like a tide, but it was fragile, resting on the assumption that compassion and urgency would not be interrupted. The arrival of first responders often represents the line between tragedy and survival. Their presence is meant to silence fear, to assure families that they are no longer alone in their fight. The flashing red and blue lights painted the street with urgency, signaling that help had arrived. Every movement of the paramedics was swift, purposeful, and anchored in the gravity of the situation. Yet, as they worked, the atmosphere shifted. The sense of hope, delicate and precious, was overshadowed by a force no one could have predicted. It was not the pain of labor complications that threatened to end everything, but the intrusion of authority twisted into arrogance, masquerading as regulation. The true disruption that night was not medical, but human, born of pettiness and control rather than necessity. For families awaiting the arrival of a child, trust in systems and communities often becomes the foundation of safety. Neighbors are expected to look out for one another, rules are designed to support, and leadership is meant to protect. But when those entrusted with authority begin to value control above compassion, rules transform into weapons. That night, the carefully maintained order of the neighborhood revealed its darker side, one built on enforcement rather than empathy. Instead of rallying around a family in crisis, the guardians of regulation sharpened their claws, prepared to enforce technicalities even at the expense of life. It was an intrusion so unthinkable, it left even seasoned professionals momentarily stunned. The sanctuary of home became a stage for conflict, and the struggle to preserve life collided with the rigid walls of bureaucracy. The night became a cruel paradox. An ambulance stood ready, its doors open to safety, yet the journey toward care was halted not by medical delay, but by human obstruction. The moment that should have been defined by urgency and unity instead revealed how easily compassion can be suffocated by obsession with power. What should have been a straightforward race to the hospital was tangled in arguments, threats, and demands for compliance to arbitrary rules. Fear, already heavy in the air, thickened as uncertainty grew. Would help be allowed to proceed, or would stubbornness cost lives? Every heartbeat became a reminder that time was not on our side. The weight of that night remains unforgettable not just because of the medical crisis, but because of the cruel revelation that safety in one's own neighborhood was conditional. Compassion was not a guarantee, and support could be withdrawn in the very moment it was needed most. The night our world shook was not only about a mother trembling in pain or the threat of losing a child. but about the awakening to a deeper truth that sometimes the greatest dangers come not from nature nor from fate, but from the coldness of those who believe rules matter more than life itself. The ambulance, a vessel meant to carry urgency and hope, became the very stage of humiliation the moment the HOA decided its authority extended beyond reason, empathy, or law. In that instant, the fragile balance between life and death no longer rested solely in the hands of paramedics, but in the grip of individuals who had mistaken power for purpose. They appeared not as neighbors or protectors of the community, but as gatekeepers drunk on control, determined to assert their dominance even when the stakes were human lives. They insisted that regulations forbade an emergency vehicle from parking where it had stopped, arguing that it blocked access and violated bylaws, as if the fine print of their handbook outweighed the cries of a woman in pain. The paramedics, already straining under the urgency of a possible miscarriage, found themselves locked in a war of words, pleading for compassion where there should have been none needed. Every second they spent justifying their presence was a second stolen from the fragile thread of life within the womb, a theft more cruel than any monetary fine could ever be. My wife, vulnerable and gasping for air, was treated not as a patient in crisis, but as an inconvenience to be managed, a problem for the board rather than a soul in need of saving. Instead of offering support, the HOA escalated their cruelty, going so far as to demand she step out of the ambulance, claiming she was not permitted to be treated on neighborhood grounds without prior authorization, as though emergencies scheduled appointments or asked for permission before striking. It was the ultimate betrayal of community, the kind of inhumanity that strips the mask off false civility and exposes the rot beneath. The paramedics fought to shield her dignity, refusing to bow to authority that held no legitimacy in the face of medical urgency, but their voices shook with the impossible tension of having to balance duty against obstruction. In that moment, the HOA revealed itself not as an organization dedicated to maintaining harmony, but as a machine of arrogance, prioritizing rules above morality, control above compassion, and bureaucracy above life. The impact of their interference was not merely procedural, it was psychological, emotional, and deeply scarring. A mother in pain was denied the comfort of knowing she was being rushed toward safety and instead forced into the spotlight of conflict, her suffering treated as a spectacle in the HOA's pursuit of dominance. Neighbors gathered in the shadows, some horrified but too frightened to speak, others complicit through silence, watching as authority abused its power in the most grotesque way possible. The ambulance stood still, lights flashing like a warning beacon, not of safety, but of injustice unfolding in real time. My wife's cries, muffled and desperate, became a soundtrack to the power struggle outside, a haunting reminder that the clock ticking was not one of patience, but of survival. Each passing minute was a crime against humanity, not just against one family, but against the very principles of community, care, and compassion that neighborhoods are supposed to embody. The HOA's actions that night were not born of ignorance, but of deliberate cruelty, a willful blindness to suffering in order to reinforce their authority. It was not enough to enforce parking rules or site regulations. They needed to prove they were untouchable, that even the most sacred of human experiences could be bent under their control. They treated paramedics as intruders, mothers as offenders, and unborn children as collateral in their game of power. To them, compassion was weakness and empathy an inconvenience. But in truth, their behavior was nothing more than tyranny wrapped in the disguise of order. The demand that my wife leave the ambulance was not just a violation of common decency, it was an assault on her dignity, an act so cruel it etched itself permanently into the memory of everyone who witnessed it. What should have been a straightforward act of rescue became a grotesque display of authority misused, the kind of moment that shatters trust forever. The interference also laid bare the hypocrisy of an organization that claimed to protect the neighborhood's well-being. For years, the HOA had hidden behind the rhetoric of maintaining harmony and property values, of keeping order so that families could thrive. But in the moment that mattered most, they revealed the truth. Their allegiance was never to people, but to power. A woman in crisis was not seen as a human being, but as a liability, an interruption to the carefully curated image they claimed to preserve. They feared not for her safety, but for their own sense of control, worried less about saving a life than about setting a precedent that might weaken their grip on the community. Their obsession with authority was so deep-rooted that they would rather gamble with blood than bend their rules, even temporarily, to save a life. It was an arrogance so profound it left scars, not only on the family they tormented, but on the soul of the community itself. That night, the HOA's interference transformed into something larger than a single incident. It became a symbol of everything broken within systems that prioritize control over compassion. It became a mirror reflecting how power, when unchecked, can corrode the very essence of humanity. Neighbors who once dismissed the HOA's overreach as minor inconveniences, unjust fines, petty citations, threats for minor violations, saw for the first time the depth of cruelty lurking beneath those surface-level abuses. The interference was not an isolated event. It was the climax of years of unchecked arrogance, now brought into the light in the most devastating way possible. For families watching, it was an awakening, a realization that silence had enabled the HOA's descent into tyranny. But for us, trapped in that moment, the interference was not philosophical or symbolic. It was visceral, terrifying, and immediate, a threat to the lives we loved most. The weight of those minutes spent arguing instead of acting cannot be measured in words alone. They were minutes stolen from a mother fighting for her child, from paramedics battling to do their duty, from a family clinging to hope in the darkest hour. They were minutes that left scars deeper than any wound, because they proved that cruelty could wear the mask of regulation and indifference could parade as authority. The HOA's interference was not just obstruction, it was violence, wielded not with weapons but with arrogance, indifference, and cruelty that cut deeper than steel. And though the night would continue to spiral toward confrontation and reckoning, this was the moment when the truth became undeniable. The HOA was not merely an inconvenience or a nuisance. It was a danger, and its interference had crossed a line that could never again be ignored. Every injustice has its tipping point, the moment where silent endurance hardens into outrage and suppressed fear transforms into defiance. And that night, as the HOA stood in the path of life itself, the breaking point arrived with a force no one could ignore. The paramedics, whose duty was to save lives, had tried reason, compassion, and professional authority, but reason fell on deaf ears, compassion was mocked as weakness, and their authority was dismissed as irrelevant in the shadow of the HOA's inflated sense of power. Neighbors who had gathered in silence began to stir, their murmurs swelling as the sight of a mother writhing in agony clashed with the HOA's insistence on protocol, their consciences awakening to the horror that unfolded before them. What had been tolerated as petty fines and relentless harassment suddenly revealed itself for what it truly was: tyranny, stripped of disguise, demanding obedience even in the face of suffering. The HOA's chairperson barked orders as though the street were a courtroom and human dignity a trivial inconvenience, but the rising tide of voices pushed back, first with whispers, then with protests, until the fragile order the board had relied on for years began to fracture. The cries of a woman in distress carried through the night air, sharper than any argument, louder than any rulebook, and they pierced the complacency of witnesses who realized silence made them accomplices. Anger, long buried under resignation, sparked into flames, and the HOA found itself no longer presiding over compliant neighbors, but over a community teetering on revolt. The paramedics, emboldened by the growing outrage around them, stood their ground with renewed resolve, refusing to obey unlawful demands that endangered life, their voices rising with the urgency of people who had sworn an oath to protect rather than to control. And then, as the tension swelled to its peak, headlights cut through the darkness, sirens joined the chorus, and the unmistakable authority of law swept onto the scene. The sheriff's arrival was not just another set of flashing lights, it was the embodiment of justice storming into a battlefield poisoned by arrogance, the long-awaited intervention of a power greater than the HOA's self-appointed reign. The board that had held its ground so confidently moments earlier faltered, their voices losing the sharpness of command as the reality of accountability loomed before them. The crowd that had once been silent now erupted with demands for justice, pointing to the ambulance, to the suffering mother, to the cruelty that had played out under the banner of neighborhood rules. The sheriff did not need to raise his voice. The weight of his presence alone shifted the balance, stripping the HOA of the illusion of control it had wielded so recklessly. In that moment, the breaking point was not only about a single night or a single family, it was about years of oppression unraveling under the pressure of truth exposed. The paramedics, now shielded by law, moved swiftly to resume their mission, their every action underscored by urgency and vindication, while the HOA, confronted with the mirror of its own cruelty, realized too late that power has limits, and when those limits are crossed, even the strongest facade crumbles. That night's breaking point marked the collapse of authority built on intimidation, the rise of a community no longer willing to be silent, and the beginning of justice for a family nearly destroyed by arrogance disguised as order. The arrival of the sheriff was not merely the presence of law, it was the manifestation of justice long denied, the force that tore through the HOA's carefully constructed illusion of power and exposed it for the farce it truly was. For too long, the board had acted as if their rules eclipsed compassion, as if their authority outshone morality, but under the piercing beam of a flashlight and the firm voice of a man sworn to uphold the law, their arrogance cracked like glass beneath a hammer. The sheriff wasted no time dissecting excuses or entertaining the self-righteous arguments the HOA sputtered out. His eyes took in the flashing ambulance lights, the pale and trembling figure of a mother fighting through unbearable pain, and the frozen faces of neighbors who had been too afraid to speak until this moment. In that instant, the truth required no explanation. The cruelty was written in every detail of the scene, undeniable and unforgivable. His words cut through the night, like a verdict, declaring that obstruction of emergency services was not a minor inconvenience, but a crime, that interfering with paramedics in the performance of their duty carried consequences that could not be erased with a fine or brushed away with bureaucracy. The HOA's chairperson, who moments earlier had demanded compliance with smug confidence, now stood trembling, reduced from tyrant to coward, realizing that the very power they worshipped had dissolved into liability under the gaze of true authority. The sheriff ordered the board members to step aside, his tone carrying no room for negotiation, and when they hesitated, clinging desperately to the last remnants of their imagined dominion, he made it clear that handcuffs were waiting. The weight of the community's outrage bore down on them, voices rising not in whispers but in shouts, neighbors demanding accountability for years of harassment and control, emboldened now that justice had a face and a voice. The sheriff directed the paramedics to proceed without further delay, his presence forming a shield against interference. And as the ambulance doors closed once more, the sound of the engine igniting felt like the release of 1,000 held breaths. Yet his work did not stop with clearing a path for medical care. He turned his focus back to the HOA, documenting every detail, taking statements, and laying the groundwork for charges that would echo far beyond one night's cruelty. Obstruction, harassment, reckless endangerment, abuse of authority. The list grew longer with every revelation, each accusation a nail in the coffin of the board's dominion. For years, the HOA had operated with impunity, weaponizing rules against the very people they claimed to serve. But now, under the sheriff's scrutiny, their empire of intimidation crumbled into dust. The neighbors who had once lived in fear came forward, their voices finally free, recounting fines levied without cause, threats delivered with malice, and acts of cruelty that had driven families to despair. The sheriff listened, not with pity, but with purpose, recording evidence that transformed grievances into ammunition for justice. By the time the ambulance was racing toward the hospital, the HOA's downfall had already begun, their reputation in ruins, their authority stripped, their names etched into reports that would summon them to court. What had started as a desperate plea for help became the spark that ignited a reckoning, one that not only held the board accountable for its cruelty, but also restored faith in the power of law to stand against tyranny. The sheriff's presence was not just an intervention, it was a declaration that no one, no matter how entrenched in power, was above compassion, above decency, or above the law. That night, the HOA learned a lesson they would never forget. When you raise your hand against humanity, justice will rise against you with a force far greater than you ever imagined. The hours that followed were filled with both relief and reflection. For though the ambulance carried my wife safely to the hospital and doctors worked swiftly to stabilize her condition, the trauma of what had happened could not be erased with medical intervention alone. She was exhausted, shaken, and scarred by the humiliation of being treated as though her pain were negotiable, her dignity a bargaining chip in a game of control. Yet when the monitor finally confirmed that our baby's heartbeat was strong and that against all odds both mother and child were safe, tears replaced fear, and the weight of gratitude made every breath feel like a blessing. But even in that fragile moment of relief, anger smoldered beneath the surface, because no family should ever have to endure such cruelty and no organization should wield power so recklessly. As news of the sheriff's intervention spread, the story quickly left the confines of our neighborhood. Local reporters picked it up, neighbors shared their testimonies, and soon the HOA's name became synonymous with abuse and corruption. Families who had once stayed silent for fear of retaliation stepped forward, emboldened by the fact that accountability had finally arrived, and the HOA's long history of harassment began unraveling in the public eye. Court cases followed swiftly, with charges of obstruction of emergency medical services, harassment, and reckless endangerment stacking like bricks in the walls closing in on the board. The chairperson, once so arrogant in their authority, was forced to stand in front of a judge and hear their actions described not as neighborhood governance, but as criminal cruelty. The fines that had once filled the HOA's coffers were replaced with legal penalties and damages, draining the very power they had wielded against us. Board members resigned in disgrace, their reputations shattered, their control dismantled piece by piece until the organization that had once ruled through intimidation was nothing more than a hollow shell. For the community, it was a rebirth. Neighbors who had once eyed one another with suspicion now united in shared determination to rebuild on a foundation of trust and compassion rather than fear. For us, it was more personal. Holding our newborn child, we knew the scars of that night would never fully disappear, but they had forged within us a resilience that no HOA, no board, no tyrant could ever again break. The sheriff's words echoed in our minds as both a warning and a promise that the law exists to protect, not to oppress, and that justice, though sometimes delayed, will always find those who think themselves above it. In the aftermath, as I watched my wife cradle our child, her eyes filled not with pain but with strength, I realized that while the HOA had tried to strip us of dignity, they had instead handed us a victory far greater than their cruelty. The proof that love and truth, when defended, can dismantle even the strongest walls of oppression. The story of that night became not just ours, but a reminder for every family that compassion must never be sacrificed at the altar of control, and that when humanity is denied, justice will rise to restore it. If this story moved you and showed just how far HOA abuse can go, don't let it stop here. Smash that like button, share this video with friends and family, and most importantly, hit subscribe to join us here on HOA Denied Access. We expose the truth behind power-hungry HOAs and bring you emotional, eye-opening stories every week. Together, we can shine a light on injustice and make sure no family ever suffers in silence again.